There is a lot of debate around the topic of advocacy and activism by scientists. Because conservation sits at the nexus of natural science and policy, conservation scientists and other professionals in the field often find that they need to strike a balance between scientific objectivity and political advocacy. In this video, we will look at the question of whether conservation scientists and other professionals can or should be advocates or activists for conservation policy. First, let's start with what we mean by advocacy and activism. Advocacy is speaking, writing, or arguing in support or defense of a particular position or cause. This could include things like presenting on a particular opinion, writing an opinion piece, or giving recommendations for policy or management actions. Activism is more about drawing public attention and concern to an issue of importance. Typically, this involves trying to convert an unaware or unempathetic public into a public that is aware of and likewise concerned about the issue. In some cases, an advocate may also be an activist. A lot of the big environmental and conservation NGOs are increasingly playing both roles, working to advocate for specific policy and management decisions, while also spearheading public awareness campaigns. Activism in environmental issues and conservation sometimes gets a bad rap, as it's often associated with some of the more extreme groups like the Earth Liberation Front or the Sea Shepherds Conservation Society. But activism can take on many forms and can be as simple as writing an op-ed or participating in a nonviolent protest. By engaging in advocacy or activism, conservation scientists are sometimes viewed as not being objective, as having lost their scientific credibility, but this is not necessarily the case in other scientific fields. For example, in healthcare, medical researchers are often involved in public debate. Think about the last couple of years in the COVID-19 pandemic. Researchers in medical fields like epidemiology, vaccine research, and public health have been vocal about their support or disagreement with various policies and government decisions in response to the pandemic. However, in the eyes of the public, this is often viewed as science communication and not necessarily advocacy or activism. The distinction between advocacy and science communication is commonly made on the basis of objectivity. The thought is that science communications is honest and neutral, sticking to the pure facts, and that advocacy is value-based and inherently biased. But this is an oversimplification of scientific objectivity, because it assumes that science is value-neutral, which it is not. As we've been talking about throughout this course, we all have values and experiences that affect our work and create biases. But the important thing is not to ignore them and pretend that science is neutral, but rather it's important to acknowledge that they are present and how they affect our choices. Advocacy or activism by conservation or other scientists is usually objected to on one of three key lines of argument: that engaging in advocacy damages your scientific credibility, that advocacy is outside of the scope of science, and that science should strive to be value-free and that advocacy is inherently incompatible with this. Let's go through each of these objections in more detail. First, there's little evidence to suggest that engaging in advocacy damages one's credibility as a scientist. As I mentioned earlier, plenty of scientists and other researchers in health and medical fields engage in advocacy or activism all the time with no damage to their credibility. But even within conservation, there are plenty of examples of prominent scientists who also engage in advocacy. For example, E.O. Wilson, Jane Goodall, and Jane Lubchenco are all highly accomplished scientists in their own fields. They are also all highly accomplished advocates and have brought a lot of public attention to issues like the importance of protecting massive tracts of land, chimpanzee and other primate conservation, and marine protected areas. Rather than perceived objectivity, the key to building credibility with the public as an advocate is effective communication, familiarity, and trust. Advocacy can also be a positive to one's scientific career, as it's becoming more common in grant applications to require community outreach and extension work, And tenure committees at university are considering outreach work more and more in addition to scientific publications and other more traditional metrics of success. Another common argument is that advocacy and activism are outside of the scope of scientists, and that it should be left to groups like NGOs and other public interest groups. But this is a difficult sell to most conservationists, as many people get into conservation because they felt an ethical imperative to fight for the natural world. Many people get involved with conservation because they love nature and they see that nature is being harmed and they want to do something about it. Many people get into conservation because they feel a deep connection to the natural world and they want to work towards the protection of the things they love. So many also feel an ethical imperative to speak out on the issues that they believe in. Many conservation scientists also see the advice of avoiding engaging in advocacy and activism as a tough sell, because environmental NGOs are increasingly focused on climate change and not necessarily conservation. And when they do focus on conservation, it's often through the lens of charismatic species. So many conservation scientists are beginning to feel they have to advocate for what they believe in, because it doesn't always feel like somebody else is. Many NGOs are also becoming more engaged in research, which is further blurring the lines between science and advocacy and activism, and raising even more questions of who exactly should be responsible for advocacy and activism. This has led many conservation scientists to take the approach of, if not me, then who? Finally, there is the view that science should strive to be value-free and that advocacy, which inherently involves values, is incompatible with this. Values in science are often viewed with suspicion, as science is perceived to be a place that is value-neutral and rooted in objectivity. The idea is that science is based on facts and purely interested in just the way the world is. Science doesn't concern itself with the tedious and undecidable debates about matters of value. But science is not value-free. Ethical and social values, like the desire to promote economic development, public health, or environmental protection, often play integral roles in scientific research. Values impact what research projects we choose to take on, and what research questions we choose to ask. But they also impact how researchers go about studying these topics and the methodological decisions they make. Science, especially in conservation, is also now often done to inform policy decision makers who need to make practical decisions on real-world problems. In these sorts of research questions, there are rarely clear-cut right answers. In this context, scientists have to decide how to extrapolate beyond the data that they have and weigh the evidence they have in order to advise decision makers. Values play a critical role in these decisions, as erring one way or another can lead to completely different policy outcomes. So it makes sense to think about these consequences when deciding how to weigh different possible conclusions. While it is impossible to completely remove values from science, scientists can take appropriate steps to manage and communicate their values and to promote a more realistic view of science as both value-laden and reliable. Furthermore, the limits of personal objectivity and the values and backgrounds of one individual scientist can be counterbalanced by a diverse scientific community. For scientists, including conservationists, who want to engage in advocacy or activism, advice often includes the instruction to separate the science and the objective truth from values. But as we've just discussed, this is really an impossible task. The key is to be aware of your values and biases and to work to minimize or at least acknowledge them in your work. This transparency can also help scientists avoid inadvertent advocacy, which is when a scientist presents a personal preference as a scientific judgment. And it can also help to build credibility and trust with the public because people tend to appreciate honesty. Conservation scientists can learn a lot about how to be more transparent from qualitative researchers who have established guidelines for the disclosure of relevant personal values and beliefs. For example, conservation scientists may ask themselves questions like, what is the research culture in my lab? What are the dominant methods that we use, and how has this affected the decisions that I make and the research that I do? Who is funding my research, and how has their value system influenced me? And what are my own personal values and prior beliefs, and how do they influence my methodological choices and interpretations? The key takeaway is that engaging in advocacy and activism by conservation scientists and other researchers is a choice. But it's not a bad choice, it's just one that needs to be well thought out.